You're listening to the Sales Success Stories podcast, where we deconstruct world-class sales performers to provide insights and strategies to help you improve. To learn more, visit us at top1.fm. Here's your host, Scott Ingram.
This episode is brought to you thanks to the generous support of ViewedIt. Boost your email response rates and book more meetings with video by downloading ViewedIt by Vidyard at top1.fm/V, or go to any page on top1.fm and click on their ad. Today on the Sales Success Stories podcast, my guest is David Weiss. David was the number one seller in his division last year at 220% of plan in the Global Enterprise Sales Division at ADP in their elite quota carrier group, which basically means that he didn't have the quota of a mere mortal. Welcome to the show, David.
Thanks, Scott. Good to be here.
So the way we got connected is actually a kind of funny story that I wanted to share real quick. It was a fan of the show and a friend of yours, Andy Rasick, who introduced us and suggested that I have you on as a guest. The irony here is that Andy is fairly new to ADP, and in his first couple of weeks on the job, he was catching up with his VP, who's also a big podcast listener, and Andy told him about this show and mentions me. At that point, Greg says, "Wait a minute, Scott Ingram? Like, he used to work here." So I once worked for ADP about 10 years ago, and Andy apparently overlaps with some of the territory I once covered, and even said he occasionally runs across my name in Salesforce. So anyway, fun story. I digress a bit, just broke my own rule about jumping right into some solid value in the first few minutes. So David, without any further ado, what are the top 3 things that you believe have allowed you to get to the top of the sales leaderboard?
Sure. I'd say the first one is, I'm a true student of sales, and I can elaborate on that, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. The other one would be I take what I do very seriously. I feel like, it's almost a sport or a science, and I'm going to talk a lot about, the science behind selling and the methodologies I use. And for me, it's a lot about, practice makes perfect, and you got to really be willing and want to be the best and really – I call it win the game, but to me that means things like, doing a lot of role playing, doing a lot of practicing, doing a lot of studying, reading a lot about, the sport, the game you're trying to play, and being the best at it, and then taking those things and executing on them in the highest degree you possibly can. So I can elaborate on any of that, but those would be my top 3.
Yeah, well, let's elaborate on each one. So you started with just being a student of sales. What does that mean, and how do you approach being a student?
Yeah, so what that means to me is, never stop learning. If a shark stops swimming, it dies. So for me, my thought there is, read as much as you can, learn as much as you can. There's some, early on in my sales career, there's a lot of different, methodologies I've picked up, whether it's spin selling or Miller Hyman or Challenger or, one I'll get into called MEDDPICC or, books on sales negotiation. I relate it back to, if you want to be great at anything, you have to become a student of that thing and really understand, what makes people amazing at what that thing is, and be able to break it down and re-engineer it in your own way. And that to me is what being a student of sales is all about.
And is it mostly reading? I mean, is that the primary source of information, or where else are you getting that information? Yeah,
it's definitely not just reading. I mean, reading is a component, but, there's things like mentorship. And I'll talk about that. There's things like, being and choosing the sales organizations you work for that have great sales training. There are things like, just getting out there and just, practicing the things you've learned and failing quick and tweaking and not making the same mistakes twice. So I'd say there's a lot that goes into being a student of sales. But if you're going to, dedicate your life to the practice of something, do it right.
Yeah, nice. And we'll come back to a number of those things. I'm particularly interested in the mentor side of things. But your second thing was treating it as a sport and a science. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so if you were going to be a chemist, or you were going to learn to play the game of golf, let's use that as an easy example. You'd be constantly practicing your swing. You'd be constantly breaking down each mechanic and piece of your swing. You would be finding, great coaches to work with. You'd be playing the game constantly. There would be so many things that you would do to become a good golfer. Then you dedicate your life to it. I view sales the same way. It's something I take seriously. So I practice it, and I treat it like a sport I want to be amazing at, or like a science that I want to learn to be great at. It's that type of, I guess, dedication and will to be the best.
Yeah, and your last point was practice. So what does the practice look like for you sort of on a daily or weekly basis?
So I would say if I was going to look at daily and weekly, I would say that's doing my job and taking it seriously and learning from the things I say and do, and breaking down, doing almost like a mental review after each call to say, all right, what did I like about the things I said? What were some of the things I could say better? How did the client react to the things I said? And taking some, personal accountability to think through those things. I would say on a much, bigger level, practice came a lot in my, earlier career, where it was, having good mentors, having role playing a lot, spending time with other great salespeople, watching what they do, and then trying to figure out a way to replicate it myself and reverse engineer it and making it my own. So things like that.
Yeah. Well, and you've mentioned twice now kind of the mentor piece. So let's talk about that. Before I finish asking David this question about mentors, I want to thank ViewedIt by Vidyard for being our exclusive sponsor of this episode. Thanks to them, you're going to get to listen to the next 90 minutes of this conversation completely uninterrupted. So I hope you'll take 3 minutes to help me thank them by going to top1.fm/V to download their free Chrome plugin so you can try it out. ViewedIt allows you to easily create personalized videos that with the click of a button, you can include in your emails to really stand out. You'll even get an email back letting you know when and how much of your video the recipient has watched. If you're not already on our mailing list, you can see some of the ViewedIt videos that I'm creating to send along with our new episode announcements. Just head over to top1.fm, get on the mailing list, and then click on the ad for ViewedIt by Vidyard to get it for yourself. Now, back to my interview with David Weiss. How are you going about seeking mentors and building those relationships?
Yeah, so one practice I've had at every organization I've been part of, and let me just back up. I'll say I've probably gotten really lucky. I've found some great people that have either hired me or that I've found and followed. I've been very lucky there. And so finding mentors is, I think you probably hear it a lot, but it's not always the easiest thing. So I'll say I'm very blessed. I feel very lucky. How I often go about it is finding people who are great at what they do and trying to add value to them while also getting as much value from them as I can. So it's maybe when you first join organizations, that's often the easiest time, asking your boss who the best people are and asking to shadow them and buying them lunch or a cup of coffee and seeing if they'd let you join on sales calls or at least picking their brain and building those relationships to a point where, they're willing to answer your questions and willing to, take you on calls and learn from them. I've also been really fortunate, even, today at ADP, but also previous organizations like Career Builder that I worked for and Monster and others that, I had great bosses that, took me under their wing and, I soaked up like a sponge. I've tried to humble myself as much as I can to be coachable and willing to learn from others and ask a lot of questions and, just put myself out there to learn.
And how big of a criteria is that for you when you're looking at a new role, a new opportunity, the leader that you would be working for?
One of the top for a new opportunity. One of the most important things. I get approached a lot by people in organizations, and I'd say one of the things that has made me, I guess, if you can create your own destiny or create your own luck. I've evaluated the people in the companies that I've chose to work for, very closely. And I'll talk about this later on in our conversation. But, I've made mistakes very early on in my career about the companies I chose to work for. And I learned from that mistake really quick. And that's where a lot of the strong evaluation came from.
Yeah. And what is that evaluation process? Like, how are you qualifying? Is this going to be a great person for me to work for that's going to support me and help me grow?
It's a lot of stuff personally and professionally. I mean, there are some pieces of it around, have you mentored other people or what are your styles when it comes to how you manage and lead people. And it's things like their selling methodologies and how they approach business and, how they handle difficult conversations and difficult situations that come up and how they are as far as, hands-on or hands-off in the field. I mean, what I try and do is break down the sales processes that I have lived in and ask how they handle, each step of the process and when challenges come up in those pieces of the process. But also, from a personal perspective, see if there's, a strong connection there.
Nice. So let's talk a little bit about your role today. I think most folks are probably familiar with ADP. I mean, it's even more impressive that you're at the top of that organization. Huge sales organization, lots of great training. But tell us about your role and kind of how you got to number one.
Yeah, so my role is within the Talent Acquisition Solutions division of ADP. And within that division, I'm part of Global Enterprise Sales. So I'm considered essentially an overlay of about 20 other sales reps at ADP that are very, very good, have, large territories, and I'm, the subject matter expert they kind of tag in, if you will, to speak with executives about talent acquisition, the marketplace, and how our solutions can impact them. So, how I got to the top of that organization, I mean, that's a big question, Scott. I think we're going to, get into that a lot around my sales methodology, and I'm going to review that. I take a very scientific approach to sales, and it's something that is teachable, is learnable, that anyone could do. And I can pretty much guarantee because I've seen it personally, results being 2 to 3x whatever they are today by, following, a subset of these methodologies.
Well, that's a pretty damn good teaser. Well, and so put a couple of things into context for us. One, just quantify your results for us a little bit more beyond kind of the 220% and talk to us about what does it mean to be part of the elite quota carrier group at ADP?
Yeah, so the 220% was, I had a $1 million quota, sold 2.2 million. So, very proud of that result. A lot of hard work went into it. And, even happier that it was part of kind of that elite quota group. So that elite quota group, it's a title that ADP gives to, their top performers. And it often comes with a higher quota, but also some, kickers and incentives if you achieve that quota, making it President's Club a little bit better and things like that. So it's a special category. They just built it a couple years ago. I would say it's definitely designed to give people that are top performers a little bit of added incentive to keep driving the number.
Yeah. And then your role is a little bit unique, although not uncommon, in that it is kind of an overlay type of opportunity. How specifically are you maximizing that type of role?
Yeah, so, I'm considered a channel partner. So like I mentioned, I've got 20 what are called district sales managers that I, get to work with. And, ADP has expectations of, probably 60 to 70% of new opportunities coming from that group, and then the other 30 or so percent coming from my own efforts. And I'm personally the type of person that doesn't like giving up control of my financial and personal professional future in the hands of other people. So I've kind of found a way through the methodologies we'll talk about to kind of flip that. So today, about 70% of what I do is very much hunting. And then the other 30% is through, the efforts of the folks I work with. And that seems to actually work really well for me.
Yeah, excellent. So obviously we've got a lot to get to, but let's go back to the beginning and just tell us a bit about your origin story and how you got into sales and the journey you've been through to date.
Yeah, so I started selling when in high school, when modems were still dial-up, and I was building and selling computers for a company called Speed PC. And I was in high school. My parents, essentially said, hey, if you want anything from us, you need to get out there and start working. So, I had an affinity for technology. So I found, a local company and right by my house. And, they were nice enough to, give me a job. And I started building computers. And they were like, hey, you're actually kind of personable for a techie. And I was like, oh, that's cool. And they were like, how about you try and sell some stuff? I'm like, all right, let's see where this goes. So I started doing that, new customers that would walk in, I'd take orders and, talk to them about what they're looking to do and build. And, was pretty good at that. So then they moved me on to actually going to people's houses and actually setting these things up and hooking up their networks and all that fun stuff. So that's how I got into sales. Then I went to college, went to RIT, got a degree in psychology and marketing. And after college, I decided, all right, well, I don't want to get my PhD. So what else could I do? And I thought, sales would be something that I've done in the past, so I might as well give that a try. And kind of the rest was history.
Nice. And what were those steps between just kind of the build up to ADP? Because you've been in a variety of different roles. Yeah.
So I right after college joined an organization called Keyence. I was there for a very short period of time. This is probably one of the early lessons I learned as far as, picking the right organization. Nothing wrong with Keyence, but they were a very much an engineering focused sales organization, not a sales training development organization. So, I didn't necessarily learn everything I needed to do to be what I consider super successful in sales. So when I left there, I sought out how to essentially find a better company for me at the time. And that's when I found Aramark. And I was at Aramark for about 3 years, worked my way up to a top performer there. Left there to go to Career Builder. From Career Builder, took a leadership role at a company called Hearst, which was selling essentially digital advertising. And then from there, Monster, and then from there, ADP.
Nice. And again, you've gone back and forth a little bit between leadership roles and individual contributor roles. How do you think about and evaluate those different opportunities? And if I'm not mistaken, you just transitioned back again into a leadership role there at ADP.
Yeah. So, I've got some, pretty big long-term goals around, hopefully becoming a chief sales officer. That's ultimately what I want to do. In order to do that, you need to have a proven track record, both as a individual contributor and as a leader. So I've tried to, impact organizations that I work for as much as possible and help them in the areas where, they thought I would be the best fit and where I raised my hand for. So, when I was at Career Builder and Aramark, individual contributors, and then Monster and Hearst, I was in leadership roles, and then started ADP and an individual contributor. And to your point, just moved back into ADP for leadership.
So I'm curious, if you were to start over, or if you could make any adjustments along that path, knowing what you know now, what might you do?
I consider myself pretty lucky, Scott. I don't feel like I've stayed at any place too long. I feel like I've learned a lot in all the places I've been. I feel like I've really impacted positively the clients I've gotten to work with and the companies I've worked for. I'm very happy with where I'm at right now, and I'm very happy with kind of the trajectory that I feel like my career is going. So I honestly wouldn't change a thing. I would say I definitely made some mistakes early on, and Keyence, as I mentioned earlier, was one of them. But from that point on, I feel like I've been really careful to evaluate opportunities. So I'm pretty happy. I wouldn't change a thing.
Cool. And from I'll ask this question two ways, and you can answer it whichever way you want. So from a challenge perspective, was there a time that was particularly challenging for you through that career? Or if you want to just talk about maybe the biggest challenge that you see for yourself in sales today.
Yeah, no, I'll tell the Keyence story a little bit. They're a company that sold sensors for factory automation. So I was a sales engineer. So they taught me absolutely everything about manufacturing and about lasers and sensors and how to position them on high-speed manufacturing lines to, do a bunch of different cool things within a manufacturing environment. what they didn't teach is sales. And they didn't teach time and territory management, and they didn't teach any sales methodologies or science behind sales. So when I joined that organization, they essentially gave me all of New York State. And I was living in Rochester at the time, and their regional headquarters was in New Jersey. And they required their salespeople to be in the office Mondays and Fridays in New Jersey, and I lived in Rochester. And then in New York State, the rest of the time. So, and mind you, no sales training, no time and territory management training. So when I got out of kind of their sales engineering boot camp, they said, okay, literally here's the bag, go. And you can imagine, a guy right out of college, first sales career, traveling back and forth, 400 miles. It was the winter. So I was having to fly and or drive from Rochester to New Jersey in the winter. So I, slept in JFK's airport multiple times. I got, stuck in the snow more times I can count. And then the whole rest of the time, I was kind of chasing my tail, trying to, sell this new solution all over New York State. And it was just a lot. And I got burnt out really, really, really quick. So after about 4 months, I said, this is not fun. And I thought sales was supposed to be fun. And this is just, I'm not having it. So I left. And at that point, I said, all right, I made a mistake. I made a career mistake. I didn't ask the right questions. I took a job that I thought was going to pay well. How do I not make this mistake before? And I landed on my next move needs to be the right one. I need to pick the right sales organization to work for. So I started researching sales organizations and actually came across a industry trade website, magazine, etc., called Selling Power. And Scott, have you ever heard of Selling Power?
I have. I haven't seen it in a little while, but absolutely.
Okay. So Selling Power every single year releases their list of the top 50 sales organizations to work for. And they did this back then. So, and I think they still do. ADP, I believe, made it last year. And so I said, okay, well, this is my list. And I applied to every single company on the list.
All 50.
I got an interview at Aramark. And so I said, all right, my number one qualifier for my next opportunity is that they're a good sales organization and I learn how to sell. So I joined Aramark, and I spent almost 4 years there. And to this day, I give Aramark credit, giving me some of the fundamentals of sales. And they approached it very methodically, very scientifically. They taught me that sales really was a science and opened my mind to becoming the student of sales that I say or feel like I've now become. So I credit them a lot. So that's kind of, where I started and, how I started learning all this stuff. That's my origin story.
Well, that's really interesting. I think there's fewer and fewer organizations like that where you can get just super high quality sales training. I'm back in the day before us, it was IBM and Xerox were sort of the gold standard. That's where you went to learn to be the best in sales. And I think you've probably named two of the better organizations that still to this day invest heavily in that training. ADP being one, Aramark being another. There's probably others out there, and I'd love to hear feedback from the audience in terms of who you think today is still doing a really great job of this. But let's flip the script a little bit, because now I'm becoming impatient. I can't wait to kind of dig into the sales process and sales methodology stuff. And why don't I just kind of set you loose? I know you've got a lot to share on that front, so I'll let you kind of present that or package that however you want.
Sure. So, big question, right? I'll try and go down the list very high level, and then I'll circle back. So, one of the first ones is account profiling. For me, anytime I get a new book of business, I spend a lot of time account profiling. So, say I got a book of business of 1,000 accounts, hypothetically. I would go to every single website of all 1,000 accounts, and I would look at what they did, how they did it, how they made money, how they aligned to, whatever company I was working for, best fit accounts. And I would do my best to narrow it down to the 10% of accounts that have the 90% chance of being the most successful when it comes to them being successful with our solution and us being successful working with them to come to a deal. From that point, I would then find out who the vetoes are within all those organizations. Very important top officers, often your CXOs or your economic buyers, true decision makers. And I would find those people and have them be part of my profiling. From there, I would use a pretty dialed in methodology when it comes to prospecting. So those are things like I still do handwritten notes. Those are things like social profiling now and social messaging. Those are things like doing a lot of emails. I'll talk about this in things that I honestly think are crazy that salespeople still do. I don't pick up the phone as much. I'll tell you, earlier in my career, that was a very different story. And I think it kind of depends on who you're selling to. But what I've found is Veto doesn't answer the phone as much. Veto needs to be sold to in slightly different ways. So I've tried to find a way when I'm talking to those specific groups to target them in the ways they like to be communicated with. But I'd say phone still is relevant in certain aspects of sales. From there, I use challenger sales methodology, as I think most people do, for conversations. CB also released a new version or an updated version of Challenger called Consensus Selling that talks about multiple buyers and talks about when people get involved in the decision process and things like that. I use that for consensus selling. I use Miller-Hyman for my account strategy. I use MEDDPICC for my deal management. And then I use the 7 immutable laws of sales negotiation for my negotiation process. And then I kind of layer all of that on top with corporate visions training around power messaging, power positioning, things along those lines. So when I talk about being a student of sales, I've kind of learned all of these methodologies along the way and found ways to kind of tie them all together to come up with a sales process that, in my opinion, drives the best results for me, but also my clients.
Well, and that's really interesting. I think that has been certainly one of the themes of the show, that there very rarely is, I use this one and only methodology and that, I just apply it out of the book. I think it's much more common that it is this conglomeration of many methodologies that you have learned and personalized and taken on over the years. What's interesting about what you just shared is it sounds like you have taken kind of the best piece of each for a specific step of the sales process. Is that a fair?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
So let me start with, there's so much there. And we'll probably do a fair amount of unpacking. But what was most intriguing to me, first you talked about just being really intentional, or sort of the territory management. You're doing the profiling. You're figuring out, okay, what am I going to put my energy to, and where am I going to focus? And then once that's done and you've got your vetoes identified, and I think this is the original title of the book, because the question is actually, if you're not picking up the phone as much anymore, how are you getting to veto today?
Yep. Selling to veto.
Selling to veto.
Selling to veto. So how I sell to veto, two things. I do a lot of mailers. So these are things, FedEx envelopes with handwritten notes in them, and or a note that I personally sign that I print out around business implications of the solution I'm trying to talk to them about, and how I directly can feel it can help their business generate or protect revenue. Everything I talk about, I see myself as a business person talking to another business person about their business. It's not about my solution. It's about the impact that I can have on their business through my solution. So it starts with a lot of understanding their key motivators, their key drivers, and most of the industries out there have, KPIs or things like that they're trying to impact. If they're large organizations, they'll have annual reports, and that's, a godsend, because it's pretty much written all out there what they're trying to do for their investors. And I take a lot of that, and I message it very, very clearly, again, all around business impact, business case improvement to them. And I send them, a package. I often include, a $5 gift card, like, let's have a cup of coffee on me or something like that, to get their attention. And then I do a minimum of 8 to 10 touches. And those are often emails. Those are often additional, handwritten notes. And those are often social media, LinkedIn, in-mails or connections and reach outs. Phone calls are occasionally used if, and in those cases, I'm not trying to, they'll all have some degree of executive assistant. So I'm not trying to get past that person. Frankly, those people I honestly believe are my friends. And frankly, they are probably the most important person to the executive I'm trying to talk to because they manage that person's lives. So I'm trying to work with them and ask them how this person likes to be communicated with and explaining what I've done and the business impact I think it can have and, asking for their support and their help. So, it's that is used probably the least amount, but I do find it effective, time and again. And then the other thing I do, and this is not the first step, this is after, numerous touches, is I'll use Outlook and I'll put an invite on their calendar, even if they haven't responded, with a simple note of why I'm trying to reach out. And again, all about their business and the implications we can have to help them, all about them, and put time on their calendar. And the response rate from that after, I've already done all these other touches is pretty high.
Well, what do you think after running that type of campaign, what do you think your success rate is? So
I can tell you right now, I get if I were to do 100, I get a 15 to 20% acceptance rate, and I get a 40+% response rate. And then the response could be not interested, not right now, thanks, but no thanks, what have you. But I'm able to set about one meeting a week, and I run these things quarterly with vetoes, with CXOs.
Awesome. And let's use that, because I know that part of your philosophy and your thinking of this like a sport is you're tracking a lot of your own stats. So what are kind of those key metrics for yourself that you're paying the most attention to?
Do you mean while prospecting or across the whole?
Well, across the board. Like what are the stats that you're tracking?
So interesting. Okay. So I do track number of things sent to response rate, open rate. That's what I use mostly for prospecting. But then as far as like my sales, I don't actually know other stats that you may be looking for there. Give me an example.
Well, you obviously know your conversion to meeting, conversion to response rate, and I know that you've got kind of other stats that you're tracking just to understand your own basically performance as a seller, lower than obviously kind of the what is my revenue contribution, right? We all know what that number is. Like everybody's tracking that, but what are you tracking below that to know that you're moving in the right direction?
All right, so here's what I'll tell you. I don't do as much of that as I did in my past. Because of the types of people I'm selling to, I'm trying to generate, potentially one new meeting a week with an executive. So, as far as a lot of those metrics, I don't track them as much anymore, and I'll be honest with that. When it comes to my past, though, when I would, for instance, I'll give you Aramark. Aramark was much higher volume. You were setting 16 appointments a week at that point. So when I was at Aramark, I was tracking. I know I needed to make roughly 200 dials a week to net myself roughly 100 responses a week from that, 100 contacts a week, yes or no. From there, converting roughly about 10% of those, 10 of them into new meetings, and then getting the rest of my meetings by doing T-calls, where, the person I met with, I would go to their neighbors and across the street. So I did a lot more metric type tracking back then. These days, what I'm basically just tracking is, how many either emails or invites or things like that did I send? What type of percentage response am I getting from those? And then almost everything else is more from a deal management perspective. So like I've got a board in my office that's first-time visits, analysis stage, demo stage, alignment stage, late stage, and contract. Those are the steps. And what I'm always looking for in those steps is essentially almost like a diagonal line where I always have a lot of first-time visits. Then the next shorter bucket is analysis. Next shorter is demo, alignment, late-stage contract, as things fall out in between. And I'm judging the health of my pipeline by making sure that this is not a lopsided or incorrectly balanced pipeline. So I do a lot of tracking as it comes to that. And then there's also things like how long things are in each stage. And then using the MEDDPICC methodology, which I can talk about, to do a lot of my deal qualification and gap analysis to understand what real next steps need to look like.
Got it. So really all about, and that's what I was looking for. I think there's two things there, right? One is you are really looking at what is the overall health of my pipeline. And I'm guessing the result of that is you don't have the peaks and valleys that a lot of folks have, where they're heavy prospecting, then they've got a lot of deals in the pipe, they're working the deals, they close the deals, and then they thud the next quarter because they've got nothing in their pipe.
Yep, that's absolutely true. One of the things I focus on every single week is prospecting, and I task manage myself like you wouldn't believe. I currently work from home. If I didn't task manage myself, I'd probably be out golfing. So I'll put my prospecting time, my client follow-up time, all my meeting times, everything I'm going to do, I have in my Outlook calendar. So, and I treat all of those things, and I think this has been important, I treat all of them like they are client meetings. So if I have on there prospect from noon to 1 on Monday, I am prospecting noon to 1 on Monday. Everything else is not important at that time, no matter what it is. Just like if I was in a client meeting, I can't just stop my client meeting to respond to an email or to do something else. I treat the things on my calendar and I take them seriously, and I block those times off accordingly.
So walk us through that picture. How much of your week is in those prospecting blocks? I mean, quantify that as best you can.
Yeah, sure. So, I take a minimum of probably 3 to 4 hours a week in prospecting and follow-up. You could probably call it almost maybe an hour a day, maybe just slightly less. And if I'm not as busy, which, occasionally happens, then I increase that number. I hold myself accountable to a consistent methodology when it comes to doing these things. I do it every single week. I feel like that's really important to avoid those peaks and valleys. And the weeks that I'm not as busy, I step that up because clearly I need more to do.
Nice. So let's first talk in a little bit more detail about the specifics of how you're structuring your days, how you're structuring your weeks, and then I want to come back and dig a little bit more into the steps of your process and MEDDPICC, which I'm not as familiar with. So walk us through however you want to take it, whether like day by day or the week overall, and then looking at the day, like to the level of detail where like I want to know what time you wake up.
All right. So I typically wake up at about 7 a.m. I've got a 3-year-old. There's no option except to wake up about 7 a.m. because I've got an alarm clock called my son yelling daddy. So I wake up at 7. I typically stop around 5 o'clock to go pick up my son and cook the family dinner. And then, after dinner, my son's down, I'll often pick things back up and finish off any sort of emails. And one of the things I always do before the end of every day is look at my day tomorrow and say, all right, what do I have on the docket tomorrow to make sure I've prepped and I'm ready for the next day. So in between those hours, though, it could be a lot of different things. I'll tell you, Mondays and Fridays, no matter what, I'm in the office. There are rare occasions, but Mondays and Fridays, I'm in my home office. Those are my dedicated follow-up days, administrative task days, things like that. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I try and be focused on client meetings. And this has evolved throughout my career. I'll tell you, and this kind of probably depends on what you're doing. If you're a work-from-home sales guy talking to executives, doing high-level sales, your day may look closer to that. When I was, pounding the pavement, driving 30 to 40,000 miles a year working for Aramark and that type of what I'd call more transactional, less strategic type selling. I was, in the car, driving around my territory, knocking on doors, making tons of phone calls, setting as many appointments as I can, trying to get referrals. I mean, there was there was a lot that went into it that was, more high production, high activity driven versus, more strategic, targeted driven than in the world I live in today. So I think it does depend a little bit on what you're doing, but that's, often how I structure things.
And walk us through, I mean, what does maybe a typical Tuesday or Wednesday look like then in terms of the blocks and when you're with clients, and is any prospecting happen? How does that all kind of fall in?
Yeah, so, I try and structure things as repeatable as possible, but I often find things don't always, follow life's plan that way. So, I have, every week, different one-on-ones with the different DSMs that I support. So those can be throughout the whole week. I structure and put, client meetings, again, Tuesday through Thursday, typically in there. And then, I will fill in those blocks with other activities like prospecting and follow-up and whatnot. So it's probably not as super structured as you're looking for. I manage myself to getting it all done. And at the end of the week, if it's not all done, then I'm not stopping that week or that day until the things I said needed to get done are done. I hold myself accountable to the end result. I don't necessarily hold myself accountable to the individual hour or the individual day when it comes to that level of repeatability. It will be, if it's on my calendar, it's going to get done at that time. That's the accountability factor. And if it doesn't, then it needs to get done. But I don't know if I necessarily have the level of structure that you may be asking.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. So at what point are you defining, and maybe it's in your evening, because you said you're kind of looking at it ahead, making sure that you're prepped. So when are you defining this is what's going to get done this day?
Typically, that's the previous week. So, we're coming up to Friday. Today's Thursday. So, I'll look at my calendar next week, because typically I book my calendar a week to 2 weeks out at all times. So my client meetings are a week to 2 weeks out. My travels are a week to 2 weeks out. A lot of my one-on-ones and administrative tasks are just reoccurring appointments. So those are fairly well mapped out. So I for the most part, going into every week, plus or minus, things that come up, know what I'm going to be doing that week. And I look at that week and I say, okay, here are my gaps in my calendar that currently no one's booked or I haven't booked. So these are the times I'm going to do these things, and these are the things that need to get accomplished. And I review my board that I mentioned earlier with the different stages, and I review my close plans and my deal plans and my gaps within those deals. And I'm like, okay, these are the things that I need to accomplish next week based on what occurred this week. And I, plug time in my calendar wherever's free.
Cool. So let's go back, because you just talked about the gaps and some of the things that you're reviewing. Let's go a little bit deeper into the sales process, and in particular, I sort of want to deliver on the promise that we suggested earlier on, that if you follow this, you've got the ability to deliver 2 to 3 times results.
Yep. So I'll go through each piece of it. I think we all know the importance of Challenger. Teach, tailor, take control. Lead with impact. Own the conversation, make sure it's with, executives that are qualified. One of the things I spend a lot of time, and this may be different than a lot of salespeople, but I will not travel for a deal that I do not feel is a qualified opportunity. So that means, I'm speaking to an executive, and there's, clear alignment around ways we can help, and that there's a business case there, and things like that. I take a very consultative approach to that. The other piece of that is, once we're actually in the deal cycle, using a methodology called MEDDPICC. And, MEDDPICC is spelled MEDDPICC. The M stands for metrics. So metrics are essentially your business case. So have you spoken to someone and quantified the challenge they're having? Not that they have a pain, but what the pain actually means to their business. I am a firm believer that everyone that works at an organization either generates revenue, enables someone else to generate revenue, or somebody there protects revenue. So for me, what I'm trying to do is quantify, since I deal in talent acquisition people strategy, I'm trying to understand, those types of positions and how people fit into those buckets, and how those buckets impact a business. I think regardless of what you're selling, if you're selling a solution to a problem, there's some downstream implication that problem is having. And it can often be quantified to a number if you ask the right questions. And the whole idea within the M in metrics and business case within MEDDPICC is, have we put our finger on what that business case is and what those metrics are and how we can impact the organization? If you haven't, that's a gap within what I consider my sales process. The next one is the E, which stands for economic buyer. That's your veto. Have you identified that person? Are you meeting with that person? Have you identified the personal and professional wins for that person? Are you completely aligned with that person on the business case and all the metrics and all the end results that your solution will have? If you haven't, if you don't know who's actually signing the agreement and you haven't identified, all of those things, that to me is a gap in the sales process. The next one is what their decision process is. So who are they evaluating? How many people are they evaluating? How long is the evaluation going to take place? Who all is involved in that evaluation? It's all the things, it's every piece that the client's process is dictating that you need to find out. And again, if you don't know it, it's a gap. Next one's the other D in there is decision criteria. This to me is essentially a client's wish list. What are they really looking for feature functionality from a solution? And how well does your solution align to that? Next one is the paper process. This is super important when you get into the prospect or the proposal, contracting, and also the commit stage within your business where you're doing your forecasts. Do you actually know who's signing, when they're signing, the steps in their legal process? Do you know if that person is on vacation for the next week to 2 weeks? Believe it or not, it happens all the time. I'm sure you've seen it. Have you really dialed in what that legal process is and how long the last solution that they signed that's similar to yours, how long that took and the roadblocks and the challenges that you may now need to overcome? And do you know the red lines and the objections you're going to get? And have procurement or the CFO or legal spoken to you yet and given you any of those objections? Because you know what, they're going to come at some point. So those are ways that the paper process is really, really, really important when it comes down to forecasting. If that's dialed in, you could tell within a day if an opportunity is going to close or not. Have you really identified pain? That's the I. Identify pain. So that to me is, outside of the business case, which is, the end result, have you kind of identified the high level reasons behind the change? Next one is, do you have a coach within the organization? And a coach is someone that will, tell you, from lack of a better word, inside information about how well you're doing and provide you and give you access to people. And when things stall or things go slow or something unexpected happens, they'll help you connect the dots and be real with you. And the last one is competition. That's the last C. Do you know who you're competing against? Do you know your strengths and weaknesses versus them? And have you been able to articulate those to the client? All of those steps in that process that makes up MEDDPICC have red, yellow, green, attached to them. And to me, I'm not comfortable with a deal until they're all green. And when they're all green, I probably have a 90+% close ratio. And I would bet, most of your listeners would as well, because there's a lot there. That's pretty much the whole sales process there when it comes to things you need to have to be confident in an opportunity you're working.
And what's the origin of MEDDPICC? Where'd you pick that up?
So I credit two companies. One of them is Monster. Monster rolled out a version of this called MEDDPICC, essentially MEDDPICC without the paper process. And I was using that for a little bit there, and they trained all their sales leaders to train all their salespeople on it. And then it really picked up with my boss right now, Gregory Donovan, really great guy. We're probably one of the better salespeople I've ever worked with. One of my, I consider, mentors, friends. He's really, really good at what he does. And, when he came to the business about 2 years ago, he brought this back up and really started driving it with his team. And it's been wildly successful. So I've seen it, work very, very well across multiple organizations.
Nice. And then how does that map to the stages that you described on your whiteboard earlier?
Yeah, so stages on my whiteboard, again, first time visit, so those are brand new appointments. Analysis stage, I start with analysis. So to me, during the analysis stage, that's where I'm finding out metrics. That's when I'm finding out decision process, decision criteria, pain. That's where I'm also trying to, identify coaches and who I'm competing against, and I'm making sure I'm selling to the economic buyer, things like that. Next stage is demo. So presenting the solution, and to me, it starts with presenting the business case. Here's what I've learned. Here's the financial implications I believe I can have for your business. Here's how my solution aligns to what you're trying to achieve. And Scott, I'll tell you, this is a stage where I walk away if there isn't that level of alignment. And that's actually the next step, is alignment. So once we do the demo, once we review all of that information, and we show how our solution can map to their pain and the implications of it, if we're not walking away with the client at that stage saying, we agree, let's explore this more, we're pretty close. If we don't have alignment, that's where I will often walk away from an opportunity, or just let the client know, hey, my job as a consultant, I've gone in, we've evaluated, we've presented what we think we can help, and we're not aligned with the end result here. So let's not spend any more time on it together, because I'm sure there are other people out there who can help you with this, and I frankly believe we're not the best fit. And that saves, I get a lot of respect from clients from that, and it saves me a lot of time, and frankly, it's a win-win for the client and my organization. Then the next step is late stage. By late stage, almost all of these should be green. We should have alignment and understanding of all of the things within the MEDDPICC process. Any gap I have within MEDDPICC, I'm trying to take from red to yellow to green. And then from late stage is also when we start presenting contracts and making sure that we are understanding any sort of legal red lines, where I'm starting to anticipate that they're going to expect some sort of change or concession or what have you to what we've proposed. And then once we're kind of in alignment there around the contract, and that we're on the same page, everything matches up, my last stage is contracting. Once you get to contracting, essentially it should be a done deal, but then you have things that can come up, and it can sometimes sit there for a while if you don't know the paper process. So that's where paper process comes within late stage in contracting.
Awesome. And then you said that you won't travel basically on spec. So at what point would you typically go on site to see a client, and how much green? I mean, what are you using to determine whether or not that's qualified?
Yeah. So what I'm looking for is it's often right around the demo stage. And what I'm looking for is economic buyer. What I'm looking for is metrics. And what I'm looking for is clear pain. If we can solve a problem and there's a business case for it, and I can have a conversation about that problem that we can solve and the implications on it with a veto, CXO, what have you, the person that could actually sign, or the person making the ultimate decision, I will get in a car, I will get in a plane, I will travel to the other side of the world at that point. But if we don't know the problem we're solving, and if we don't have a business case to solve it, and we don't have this person making the decision that we're actually presenting to, I often won't travel. I'll do it virtually until we're at that stage.
Nice. That's brilliant. Now, how would you describe your style and just the way that you execute this process?
Yeah, so I'm a firm believer of challenger sale. I think I've followed it and was taught on it from when it first came out. So I consider myself a challenger. I mean, teach, tailor, take control. My style within challenger is, I see myself kind of as a facilitator, as a consultant. I don't even necessarily call myself a salesperson all the time anymore. It's, I feel like my job is to speak to executives or speak to people about the business challenges that they're having, try to understand the implications of those business challenges on their bottom line, and then align my company solution to them. And if it's a fit, great. If it's not, that's okay too. Let's walk away as fast as possible because we're both busy people and we have other things to do. So that's how I'd consider my style.
Love it. What motivates you, and how do you think about motivation in general?
So motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Things that motivate me are I have a lot of, personal desire and life goals. I honestly love sales. I love the game. I have a strong desire to be, one of the best at it in the organizations I am lucky enough to work for and work with. So there's a lot of, a lot of care that I have there. The other, more probably extrinsic motivation is, of course, around financial freedom and kind of the ability to do what I want with my life and be able to spend time with my family. I had two parents who worked exceptionally hard. They both rose to very high levels within their careers, senior executives. And, I can tell you that one of the things when they look back on their lives, they said, you know what, I wish we had more time to do stuff together. I was very successful professionally, but, personally, my professional life took a lot from us. And I've had that conversation with them, and, I have made some decisions in my life to make sure that, I am there for my family. And I have tried to, position my what I do and my future goals to make sure that there's a very healthy balance within my life. And that's important to me, and that motivates me.
Yeah. Well, talk about, you sent me a really nice note with sort of a bonus point when I asked you for your top 3. Talk about how you think about goals and just your approach to that in general.
Yeah, so I take a very much start with why. What do I really want in life, and why do I want it? And work my way backwards. And I'm talking big, lifelong goals, and I'm talking, 5-year goals and 1-year goals, and heck, it could be a 1-week goal. And the why or the end results you're trying to get, can really shape how you do it and what you do. So Simon Sinek, I don't know if have you ever watched Simon Sinek Start With Why?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's, if you're listening to this and you haven't watched that yet, like that's required watching as part of this show. So if you've not done that yet, like hit pause, go watch that, and then you're allowed to resume as a fan of this show.
I couldn't agree more. Simon is a brilliant person. He's a very positive impact on the world. So love the guy. Anyways, so I try and look at, what are those things, and then work backwards in what I need to do to achieve them. So for instance, if I want to hit, I want to make a certain amount of money this year, and whatever that amount of money is means that I need to be a certain percentage of plan. In order to be a certain percentage of plan, I need to sell a certain amount of deals. And in order to sell a certain amount of deals, I need to have a certain number of appointments and opportunity, or a number of opportunities. In order to have a certain number of opportunities that pan out, I need to have a certain number of appointments. In order to have a number of appointments, I need to have a certain number of outreaches, and how all that fits together. And I look at that and I say, okay, here's what I need to do to accomplish that goal. And it doesn't necessarily need to be hitting goal. It could be, I want to lose 10 pounds. All right. So if I want to lose 10 pounds, here's what I need to do this week, this month from a diet and exercise perspective, and work my way backwards and plan it out and then go do it, and hold myself accountable to it. So that's how I often kind of look at these things. Yeah.
Now, David, what's your why?
I think it does go back to, what motivates me. I really want to not only be very successful in my career and like I mentioned, at some point be a chief sales officer and have, really great impacts on organizations and the clients I work with. I want to be able to sell something I believe in and that, impacts the world. That's why I'm in talent acquisition. I think, it's really really special what I'm able to do with companies. And, if people are their most important asset and I'm able to help them, impact people, I'm also able to help the people that choose to work for them and they get jobs and they can have more prosperous lives. So I feel kind of special about that. I think it's a really neat industry to work in. And then, the other piece of it again is around the financial and personal freedom to, live the life I want at the level I want to live it, and still be able to see my son grow and, be with my wife and have a good family life and those things. I think that's very important. We all work really, really hard. And at the end of the day, if you can't also enjoy the fruits of the labor, what's the point of the labor? So that's always been my thought.
Yeah, good thought. Good thought. So we've talked about sort of a number of the habits and routines so far, just in terms of the way that you are reviewing your week and planning your next day. Are there other kind of core habits, routines, rituals that are central to this process and your success?
I don't know. I start every day. I drink a really big cup of coffee, read the news, look at my board, determine what I need to do and how I need to do it, and then go do it. I would say I try and take a disciplined approach about things and, achieve the things that I said I would do and work hard to accomplish that.
Yeah. What about your information diet? Obviously, as a student of sales, this one's particularly interesting to me. What are you reading, listening to, watching, and what are you deciding what you're going to, invest that time and energy in? Yeah.
So there's a lot I've read over the years, but right now, like in front of me, I'll look at my desk. I've got the Sandler rules. I'm starting to brush up on Sandler selling. So I've got the 49 timeless selling principles and how to apply them. I've also got a book called Drive, which talks about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And then I've got the 1 Minute Manager, because having recently gotten back into leadership, I wanted to brush up on some of the leadership skills. So those are the three books I'm kind of jumping between right now. And then I just it was about 6 months ago, and I've read things in between, but one of the standouts was the 7 Immutable Laws of Sales Negotiation. And that one's really interesting. I, through just being in sales for 10 years plus, I had adopted some of them, but there's that one's a standout for me because it talks about things like not negotiating until you know you're number one. So if you not even starting a contract negotiation unless you are the client's number one choice, because you can't negotiate to be the best. That just involves price concessions, and that ultimately hurts the business. Have a business plan. Then we've talked about business cases a lot. It talks about plan on getting squeezed, plan on that you're going to be asked for something and try to anticipate what those things are, and leave them in purposely so you aren't at bare minimum by the time you get to that point. Talks about finding non-monetary trade-ups, and that was really interesting to me because it talks about how to actually build those within your own organization. Definitely recommend the book. One of the things we started doing is looking at what can we provide to our clients that are of value to them that don't impact fully our revenue and our margins, because at the end of the day, the business is a public company, and we need to think about our shareholders too. Never give, and then one of the biggest ones, never give without getting. If someone asks you for something and you're willing to give it to them, that's fine, but you have to get something in return. And that can be signature dates, that can be access, that can be information, it can be a lot of different things, but don't give without getting, give to get. And the last one is if things aren't panning out, walk away. So, that was a great book, great read, solidified some of my own beliefs and taught me a few things. So if you guys haven't read it, that's a really good one as well.
Good. So obviously, big reader, lots of books. That sounds like a pretty good set there. Is there anything that you listen to regularly or watch? So
I'm a huge fan of the LinkedIn newsfeed. Unfortunately, that takes probably more time away than I'll care to admit. But there's often things that come up there that are very relevant that I either listen to or read. There's industry trade journals and websites. One of them for me is ERE. That's the kind of the industry trade journal for talent acquisition. So I like to check that out, a couple times a week, see what's new there. And then I'm a huge fan of decompressing throughout my day. And believe it or not, and it's probably not the best time economically, but I decompress by watching the news. And there's a lot of things going on in the world right now that are tough. But I like to, stay up to date there. So that's kind of a morning and night routine for me.
There you go. What about tools and apps? What drives your day and supports a lot of this stuff?
So I don't think I'm groundbreaking here. LinkedIn, unequivocal, need it. Outlook, I'm task managed and manages my entire day. The other two, very old school, Post-it notes. Scott, I love Post-it notes. I will put so many to-do lists and people I need to talk to or actions I need to take. I love Post-it notes. And then a whiteboard. I have Salesforce.com. I'm a fan of Salesforce. Don't get any of this wrong. But I am a big fan of the old school, big old whiteboard with all of my accounts and my deal stages on it. Because when I'm, sit down for my day and I fire up my computer and I got all these emails and link messages and LinkedIn and all these things, it's very comforting to not have to open one more app or one more website or thing. I can literally just rotate my chair and I see my board and I'm like, that's what I need to do today. I need to make sure one of these things progresses in its stage. And it's a nice, comforting, focused type thing that I do every morning.
Yeah. And now how often are you updating that whiteboard? Is it an all the time thing, or do you have a certain time that you're kind of bringing it up to speed on a daily, or how does that work?
So I try and do it in real time, but we all know how our days can get away from us. So at the very least, at the end of every week, I take time on, late Fridays to do that. But I try and do it in real time.
Yeah, love that. Now, David, one of the things, we don't have to figure this all out right now, but I want to work with you and figure out what can we offer as an example. And maybe it's obviously without all of the confidential details, like a picture of your whiteboard or some of the sales planning documents that you use. I'd love to include that in our sales success community. So David and I will figure that out afterwards, but you can find whatever goodies we come up with to put in there. All you have to do to join that free community is go to top1.fm and get on the mailing list, and you'll get an invite right away. Or if you're in the US, you can text top1 to 444-999. Those are the two ways to get in. So we'll figure out something fun there. Now, David, you already kind of hinted at one of these, and maybe there's more than one thing, but what is it that you believe that the average seller thinks is crazy?
So I think we've covered some of it, but just to reiterate, the amount of time I spend before I travel on qualifying an opportunity. I'll tell you, Scott, I wasn't always this, maniacal about how I approached that. Back in the day, you called me, I'll be there, give me 5 minutes and I'll find a way to get to you. But I think as I have progressed through my sales career and time became more valuable, and the people I was speaking to, became at a higher level, and the deal size grew. The fanatical deal qualification became more and more important to me. So that may be a little bit different. I'd say the whole thought around how I structure. I still believe in handwritten notes, and I still believe in FedEx packages, and I still believe in coming up with ways through those methods to kind of cut through the noise. I'll tell you, I do believe that getting to Veto and staying at Veto is possible. I think it's not as hard as some people may make it out to be if you can, again, lead with the value to their organization, with the business case, with the why. And then the last piece is, I'm happy to walk away. I mean, if there's not clear alignment between both organizations, it may not make sense, and that's okay. And I think, I still, see salespeople that try and, save the deal or fight for the deal or try and win unwinnable deals or spend their time on deals that, have low to no probability of closing. And, I'm not saying that, off the cuff, if based on, deal qualification and based on MEDDPICC, if everything's in the red, probably not going to close. Why are we spending so much time on it? So those are probably, they should fit into that bucket.
Yeah. And again, something we've probably touched on a little bit. Maybe there's one that stands out as far as the most important decisions you've made or lessons you've had to learn to really get this foundation and the groundwork for where you are today.
So I think some of the most important decisions I've made is, fail quick, fail often, learn from it, work for great organizations, find and work for, great people and great mentors. Don't just chase the money, sell and do what you believe in. And that's always been really important to me. I mean, I get folks reaching out all the time, and this is not an ego thing. It's just reality, asking, me to sell for them. And, it's a lot of, not saying I don't believe in what they're selling. I'm sure they're in business for a reason. It's a great product, but at the end of the day, I need to be passionate and excited that the things that the company I'm selling for brings to the table really can impact the companies that I'm working with and for. I believe that selling for the best organizations that do anything, and selling for organizations that really, impact our clients, that to me is just so important. So, those are probably up there with the most important decisions I've made.
Yeah, and I wonder if you've got that in, and maybe not those ones, but if you've got a particular favorite sales story that you like to tell, and I'm most interested in, like, what's the lesson from that? Like, what did you take away from just a fun story?
So, great question, Scott. When I first started in my sales career, I was definitely what I consider more of a relationship seller. So, I'd work really hard to build relationships with, different organizations and different things. I was actually, it was when I was at Aramark. This happened a lot when I was at Aramark. I'd be working with these companies, and Aramark did a lot of different things, but one of the main things they did was uniform and facility services. So I was selling floor mats and bar towels and cooks' uniforms and uniforms in general to lots of different organizations in Rochester, New York. And one of the, like I said, would love to build relationships with people and things along those lines. And what started happening was, through the course of, normal sales, I'd lose deals. And I would lose deals with these companies that I would sometimes frequent personally, like bars and restaurants. And there was one sushi place in Rochester, New York, that was my girlfriend at the time, soon-to-be fiance, soon-to-be wife, her absolute favorite restaurant. Loved it. We'd probably go, once a week, maybe more. And while I was there, I, started working with their general manager and building a relationship over time. And, I was really excited and had a, pretty sizable opportunity with them and yada, yada. And they chose to not buy from me. I took that personally. As a young salesperson might, and I chose to never go there again. So my wife no longer got to go to her favorite sushi place because I lost a deal. I feel like I've grown a lot since then, and I've learned a lot about business since then. But I actually harken back to that every once in a while when I think about relationships within sales and putting so much weight on them that they can kind of impact you. So that's just it's interesting.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you ever sold uniforms to the good folks at Dinosaur Barbecue.
So I did. They were not a client. I absolutely tried, but I will give a major shout out to Dinosaur Barbecue. If your listeners have never been, it's a place in Rochester, and they also have locations. They start out in Syracuse and Brooklyn, and it is the best barbecue I've ever eaten in my life. And I'm in Texas, so I think that probably says a lot.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that I was going to make a very, very guilty admission here because I discovered Dinosaur in Syracuse. where my wife's family was when we first met. They're now here with me in Austin, but it's almost embarrassing for me to say, as an Austinite, that my favorite barbecue in the world is in upstate New York at Dinosaur Barbecue, and it's a biker bar. I mean, it is an experience. You got to go do it. If you're ever in upstate New York and you don't check out Dinosaur Barbecue, you are doing yourself a disservice. So, David, how did you get from Rochester to Houston?
So my wife got her PhD at the University of Houston. She's from New York. We met when she was on her postdoc in New York. I was still living there. We hit it off. We really great relationship. I was in the middle of winter, in the middle of an ice storm in Rochester.
This isn't a hard decision, is it?
No. My wife said to me, hey, have you ever thought about Houston? As you know, I went to grad school, or I went to school there. I'd love to maybe go back. And I told her at the time, her name's Erin. I said, Erin, I'm from Boston. I went to school in New York. I'm a New Englander. I don't wear cowboy boots. I don't wear cowboy hats. I don't carry a gun. I do not drive a pickup truck. And I don't know what an oil rig is, and I have no intention of ever, being on one or driving past one. And she laughed, and she said I was crazy, and said, it's the middle of winter, let's just go. So I said, okay, fine. So we came down and visited, and she, knowing me and how much I love food, she decided to take me to some of the amazing Tex-Mex restaurants in Houston and give me a bunch of margaritas and fajitas and all that fun stuff in warm weather. And it was about 3 months later when we left Rochester and moved to Houston. And I have never looked back. I will never shovel snow again. I will play golf as much as I can all year round, and it makes me a very happy person to think about that.
Wined and dined and sold on Houston.
She is a better salesperson than me. She closed that deal like in an hour.
No, let's be fair. That is not a hard sale at all.
No, it wasn't hard at all.
So this is what I like to think of sort of the soapbox session. So I'm gonna get out your little box that you can stand on and just let you kind of dispense advice here a little bit, starting with, what would you suggest to somebody that's just getting started out in either a brand new sales career, or maybe they're starting a new position? Sales
is a science. There are so many great books and methodologies and ways to approach it. I am often amazed at how many salespeople I still even talk to. And, ADP is a hotbed of amazing sales culture and training and people. So it's typically outside of ADP. I'll say that people don't have dialed in methodologies. If I ask them, how do you sell? What have you adopted as your methodology? The most common answer I'll get is Challenger, and I almost won't get any other depth besides that. And don't get me wrong, Challenger is amazing. It's part of the fundamentals of how I handle executive conversations. But there's so much more out there. I would say, open your mind, go find those things and adopt those things and make those things your own, because it can just drastically improve your personal and professional life as well as your clients. I mean, there's just so much there.
Well, David, let me interrupt you there, right? So what is that the responsibility of the individual seller to go pull that all together? And that'll create a follow-up question for me. Or do they just need to make sure that they're going to work for an organization that has the right foundation and can actually articulate what their freaking sales process is?
I would honestly say both. If you're lucky enough to work, in a top 50 organization to sell for, or with an organization that has, built and discovered and created a great sales process, that's awesome. But I've met very few organizations that have it all. They typically have chosen to focus on a singular methodology and dive into it headfirst. And one of the things I've even, worked with ADP, a great sales organization, on is how to, expand that footprint even a little bit more. ADP is big on Challenger and consensus, but They're recently starting to adopt the laws, the semi-renewable laws of sales negotiation. They're recently starting to adopt, MEDDPICC and things like that. It is about a very well-rounded scientific approach and methodology to all of it. And it is, in my opinion, the responsibility of the person. At the end of the day, if you're going to choose sales as your lifelong career, make the most out of that choice and take ownership to accomplish, your goals and do that through, executing on these things. It can be taught, it can be learned. And Scott, I'll tell you, man, this, in my opinion, is the differentiator between people that are, good at sales and great at sales and are, the best, is how much of different methodologies they work into their, processes and how well they execute on them.
And what is, I think if you're starting that journey, there's just this overwhelming sense of overwhelm, right? There's so much out there. There's so many books. There's so many methodologies. I mean, there will be dozens of new sales books this year and new ideas. So how do you go about assembling that process and that methodology for yourself and choose from this sea of options?
Yeah. And man, that can be really tough. And I don't want to say that everything I've said today is the end all be all. It's what works for me. And I've read a lot of them, and the ones that I've chosen and kind of worked into, I've mentioned today, and I definitely feel like they're worth a read. But I'm sure there's stuff out there I don't know. I'd love to learn it. But I would probably start with, the most common. I talked to some of the best folks that are both sales trainers as well as employees at, whatever organization you're at, and see what methodologies they subscribe to, and adopt those, because there are different, methodologies that probably are better fits for different organizations. But what I'll tell you is, in my opinion, there's some really strong foundations. Things like, Neil Rackham's spin selling, or Sandler, or Challenger, or Miller Hyman and Aklevis, and MEDDPICC, I'd say, is fairly new, but definitely out there. So I would focus on some of those really good core ones, and then maybe do your own research to find others that are a fit. Amazon's a great place to go to see what are top rated or best sellers or have the most stars from other salespeople. I check that out every once in a while as well. I mean, there's a lot out there, but there's definitely some core ones that you can find.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll do a little bit of consolidation here, now that we're a little over 20 episodes in. The most common mentions by the folks who are all top sellers on this show have absolutely been Challenger and Sandler, and then it starts to kind of spread out after that. David, is there a resource to go learn about the ins and outs of MEDDPICC?
You can actually Google it, and it will break it down. But I do have a PowerPoint on it I'd be happy to share.
There we go. See, more stuff for the sales success community. So top1.fm people. All right. Let's see. Where are we? So we talked about that's for somebody who's new into sales. What about somebody who's further into their career? So they are more established. They've got things figured out. They're doing okay. Maybe they're making quota or they're making President's Club, but they're not at the top, right? They've not breaking into that kind of elite quota group. What advice would you give to them to take it to the next level?
I'll give them the exact same advice I give myself. You can always be better. And if you take an honest evaluation of what you're doing, how you're doing it, why you're doing it, and really break yourself down. Scott, I try and do this every couple years because, you can have a really good run and all of a sudden you're like, man, this was a bad month, or this was a bad quarter, a bad year. Why? And I think we've all been there. I think we've all, got to a point where we've been, made a ton of money and things were great. And you're like, you know what? I don't need to do this anymore. And then you're like, oh, yes, I do. So it's taking that, honest evaluation of yourself and saying, all right, here are the steps in my process. I'm I'm a real process driven person. I believe in it. So I go back to the process and I say, all right, do I not have enough new meetings? Okay, so maybe I need to prospect more and I need to find or develop or improve my methodology for that. Am I not getting enough qualified opportunities to the demo phase? Okay, so I need to work on my analysis questions and building better business cases and leading with impact and understanding the pain. I need to maybe do a better job there. If I'm not getting past the demo phase, well, maybe I need to work on my presentation skills, or maybe I need to brush up more on the business case and presenting and making sure it has better alignment. If I'm not getting past my alignment phase, all right, maybe I need to look at my analysis phase again. And if I'm losing a lot of things at late stage or contracting, okay, so what happened earlier in my process? Did I not build that strong enough business case, or did I not, make sure I qualified the deal, or was I not working with the right people and have my coaches or my economic buyers or technical buyers identified? I mean, again, sales is a science, and with any science, you should be able to, manipulate and break apart that puzzle and break it down and then rebuild it and say, where were my gaps? I mean, take a hard evaluation, hard look at that. I can almost guarantee, some of them you'll find something somewhere that can be improved, and then, go find the best people that are doing that thing or that piece of the process, or a book or a podcast, or, ask someone that's doing a great job at it, something. And then whatever you find, be consistent with it. That's one of the biggest things. I mean, me personally, I try and be as consistent as I can for at least a set period of time, whether that's a couple months or, however long it takes to, get good at the change and make sure the change is working. And then if it's not, find another one. I think those are really important to kind of diagnose yourself.
Well, okay, so if sales is a science, is there a unified theory of sales, right? Is there one formula, at least at sort of a core fundamental level, that applies, or do you sort of have to create your own formula depending on your solution and your territory and does it change every time?
So I honestly believe there's a code. I honestly believe there is a formula, a best way. But then I also believe you need to tweak it and adapt it to fit your organization and your style. But I think there's core fundamentals, just like there are core fundamentals with most sciences that lead to the highest percentage of positive outcome. Now, just because you do all the right things doesn't mean you get the right result. It's all about probability in my mind, and saying, all right, I need to do all of these things in the exact right way, and that increases my likelihood of creating a positive match between the client that I'm trying to help and the business I'm trying to generate revenue for, and match those two together. And by doing it right, each step that you do correctly and execute on well increases that probability of the fit. That's kind of how I look at it. Now, like I said, you may need to adapt it based on your company, but I think there's a lot of core principles here.
Well, and here's my challenge and my perspective, right? Because in some ways, like, this show is my science experiment. I wanted to go and figure out basically what is the formula, right? What is the way that is going to guarantee you that you're going to be maybe not the very best, but really, really good and top of the leaderboard. And it is a struggle for me. It's an interesting thing that I get to do, and a lot of times I'll go be a guest on another show, and I get to talk about this, which is always a lot of fun. And it's looking for those common themes. And I would say at this point, there's almost more beyond the basics. Like, there's absolutely some core fundamental things. Like, if you're going to slack off, and like, you're never going to be at the top if you're not working hard and being pretty organized and having a strong approach and using some of these things. But beyond that, I feel like what I see is people having a really strong sense of self-awareness and knowing who they are. and applying their skills and their unique attributes and just sort of maximizing that. And that's all over the board, because I mean, a lot of folks have called out specifically, like, I'm an introvert, right? I'm not going to be the one that's super outgoing. And they tend to be much more process oriented, and they sort of make up for it in the detail and the strategy and the approach. So where's that commonality? Like, what's the formula that we can all take, at least as the I guess it's my favorite word these days, like, at least as that foundation?
I'm not claiming to have all the answers.
What? Dude, that's why you're here.
Here's what I'll tell you. Look at your process. Look at every step of your process. And then say, what is the best way to execute on each piece of the process? Like, for instance, you mentioned Challenger as the common theme. But I've read Challenger. I've taught people Challenger. Challenger's great, but Challenger is very much focused just on executive or just on conversations, how to manage a sales call, how to teach, tailor, take control, create uncomfortable situations and tension. It's very much about the conversation and how you approach that conversation. But conversations, although incredibly important in sales and very much a differentiator, are only a piece of the puzzle. There are a lot of other steps within the sales process beyond that, conversation. And I don't know if there's been a real good synthesis of all the different steps in a sales process dialed into a singular methodology. And I think that's where there's a lot of gaps, because everyone's latched on to Challenger, and I'm sure it's impacted a lot of organizations in a lot of positive ways, but I feel like there's a lot more to this. So I do feel like there's
yeah, like Challenger doesn't apply if you're not having a conversation in the first place. Right,
exactly. And then it doesn't apply when you get into contract negotiation. And it does to a point, but it doesn't cover all the buckets. And it doesn't list it. It doesn't break down the process exactly how, what you need to talk to people about. And it doesn't break down, a solid analysis that leads to a business case. It doesn't. So, I think there's a lot of steps within a perfectly run sales process. And what I tell anyone is, whatever your sales process is, look at it. Look at it really hard. Look at every single step that makes up from start to end of implementation to go live to client retention. I mean, full life cycle. Break it all down. What are every single pieces that influence it? And how does your organization develop the best methodology for every single piece? I feel like I have done a decent job in my career looking and approaching sales that way and helping organizations think about it that way, and then developing, how to impact each of those little buckets. So, but I don't think there's been a really great job or movement within sales to do that. I think we've all focused a lot on these individual methodologies. I don't think anyone's ever actually brought it together well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good insight, because you're right. There's so many pieces of this. The reality is, if somebody did pull that all together, that would be a very long book, because there's just so many steps and so many phases. And I think we're also starting to become more aware. Certainly in my world, right? I mean, I work with marketing a lot of times, is looking at the full customer life cycle, right? Not just first call to close. Like in my book, like that's the beginning of the relationship. Yeah. So how do we get to renewals and upsells and referrals and advocacy and all of these other things, which there's another 800 pages.
Yeah, and retention. Long-term retention.
Exactly.
Yep. That's where so many organizations fail is around long-term retention. They keep the client for the 3-year sales cycle. Then, the next shiny thing comes along and you lose to their competitor because they weren't doing certain things during the client life cycle to make sure they were aware of all the things that they could do with whatever the client was innovating and coming up with next. I mean, I've seen that a lot.
Yeah. And the cost of that is huge with us all being in these more sort of SaaS or subscription type models where, man, if you lose a client in the first few years, you're basically upside down on that deal.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the long-term value is in retention if done right. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So, David, if you were in my shoes, if I were wearing shoes, what question would you want to ask the folks that I interview, folks like yourself?
I'd love to learn from them, kind of their process. Very similar to things I've been saying. I'd love to learn from them, what their best practices are in each stage of the process. I'm a big, I'll say it again, scientific approach to sales.
So you want to know their formula.
I want to know their formula.
Yeah.
Maybe it makes my formula better. Maybe I can help them with their formula. Maybe together we can come up with a combined better formula. I don't know. But I'd love to get their thoughts on this concept.
Yeah. Now, if you were on the other side, right, if you didn't know you and you didn't know your formula, is there anything that you haven't shared yet about kind of the details of your approach that you would want to know?
I don't think so. I honestly believe we've covered it. Yeah.
Okay. So who is the most successful salesperson you know personally?
So I'll tell you right now, I took an ego play here for about 10 seconds when I was first thinking about that question. I was like, it's me. No, I have honestly gotten a chance to work with some great people. I'll tell you, and I'll give a few shout outs. I mean, early on in my career, there was a gentleman by the name of Rob Kraveritis, who was one of my mentors at Career Builder and brought me to Hearst. And I worked for him. I was a leader under him, sold a lot with him. Really great guy. Learned a ton. I'm working with a gentleman by the name of Gregory Donovan right now, who is absolutely phenomenal. Great leader, great mentor as well. I've had a lot of successes, but I'm very thankful for, the people I get to work with, the organizations I've worked with. ADP, again, one of the best sales cultures I've had a chance to work with. So, there's a lot of great salespeople here that have taught me a lot, and I, hopefully have, shared some best practices with them that have helped them as well. So, I couldn't say more about some of the companies I've worked with and the people I've gotten a chance to work for. And that would be one of the things I'd stress as well is, find those good companies, find those good people, latch onto them, stay there as long as you can, as long as, it's benefiting, both parties.
Yeah. Well, and to echo just the ADP piece, I mean, I had a really great experience there. It really is such a strong, positive sales culture for the most part, and just a great place to go and learn. I think particularly early in your career to sort of build that type of foundation. I certainly benefit a lot from the couple of years that I spent there, which also was pretty early in my career. So before I ask kind of the final wrap up question, is there anything that we left in the chamber that you wanted to kind of get out and share? Because I know you did a fair amount of prep for this conversation, so I want to make sure we covered everything that you had.
No, Scott, I mean, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I really appreciate you having me on. I think we've covered all of it, but if there's anything that comes out of this, we'll be happy to do a follow up and support it. I think it's a great forum.
Love it. Perfect. All right. So that brings us to the last question, and this is where we try and make this actionable. So for those listening, we release new episodes every 2 weeks. So I finally settled on, it probably makes sense to ask for a challenge that would last about 2 weeks. So you've got something that you can actively do and work on before the next episode comes out, and you've got a new challenge to work on. So David, what would you challenge the listener to do right now over the course of the next 2 weeks to improve themselves and improve their own sales results?
So I would say, think about your sales process. And I'm turning into a broken record here, and Scott, I apologize. But think about your sales process. Break those steps down. Look at how you're executing on each individual step of the process, and then take a hard look and make some decisions. Do I need to block more consistent time to prospect? Do I need to work on the questions I ask and how I'm doing analysis. Am I building business cases, and am I building them with the right people with the right data, and presenting them at the right times to the right people? How are my presentation skills going, and do I need to brush up on that? Am I doing a proper alignment, or am I just, as soon as I find pain, presenting a proposal and asking if the pricing looks good? I mean, break those things down. Look at every step and look at how you're doing it. And find areas that you can improve, and then seek out people that can help you improve them. I'm saying this from personal experience. It's exactly how I've approached it throughout my career, and I feel like those things have continued to help me to improve, and I will continue to do them because I think that's the best way to always get better at anything.
Perfect. David, this has been incredible. I know that we are going to have maybe the richest set of notes related to this episode, because there's a lot of resources, and I will call out and have links to all of the books and all the different methodologies that David has talked about. I don't know what episode this will be when we launch it, so if you go to top1.fm/Weiss, WEISS, it'll absolutely be there. That'll get you straight there. And, of course, once you're there, you can sign up for the newsletter, which will get you the invite to the sales success community, where all of the good stuff happens, and all the secret uber goodies that David is going to come up with for us will be. So thank you so much for joining us, David. I really appreciate your time, and everybody who spent the time with us to listen to this thing all the way through. I think it's been super valuable.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate you having me on.
Thanks for listening to the Sales Success Stories podcast. To be sure you never miss an episode, and for an invitation to our sales success community powered by Influitive, subscribe to our newsletter at top1.fm.